even if I do say so myself. It's an absolute incredible honor to have my next guest, and you will learn why. Let me give you his profile first. Emeritus Professor, and I won't say his name, CBA, is a former senior United Nations official with decades of experience in crisis and conflict zones, from Rwanda to Sudan, where he has consistently called the world to attention to account in the face of genocide and mass atrocity. As the UN's former resident and humanitarian coordinator in Sudan, he was one of the earliest and most vocal whistleblowers of the Darfur crisis, forcing international attention on a tragedy that the world had tried to ignore. Today, as the international community faces deep scrutiny over its response to the suffering of Palestinians and what many are calling a genocide, Emeritus Professor Mukesh Kapila joins me on Borderlines to examine the United Nations responsibility to protect, R2P for short, and asks the urgent question: has the world once again failed the people it promised to defend? Prof, it's an absolute honor. I really can't express what an honor it is to have you on our show today.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to join you.
Thank you. So, first of all, if you could take a minute just to unpack for my listeners, and we have listeners from all over the world, a whole lot of people would not have heard of R2P, responsibility to protect, what it actually means, please.
Well, what happened after the Rwanda genocide in the last century, the world was so shocked and horrified that genocide had happened that it came together and passed a resolution called the Responsibility to Protect, which basically said that if there were crimes against humanity suspected, including ethnic cleansing and genocide, then there was a responsibility to intervene, to stop what was going on, starting initially with the country itself. The country concerned where such terrible crimes were being committed had the primary responsibility to stop doing it and preventing a worsening of the situation. If that didn't happen, then other countries could get together and help that country to stop the terrible things that were happening. And that became known as the Responsibility to Protect. It was adopted in a General Assembly resolution in 2005, and it's been referenced scores of times in numerous other UN resolutions in both the Security Council and the General Assembly.
That's in principle. In practice, then, what is actually supposed to happen physically?
Well, what's physically supposed to happen is that if a country is committing crimes against humanity, against its own people, it must it's given a warning and says, hey, what you're doing is wrong, stop doing it, and it's your responsibility to make sure you bring the elements that are committing these crimes under control. What you're doing is illegal, immoral, and completely unacceptable. So obviously, a country that is determined on killing its own people is not going to listen to this. And so Pillar 2, what I've just talked about, is called Pillar 1. Pillar 2 is then other countries can say, okay, clearly you need some help to try and get law and order in your country, and we are here to help you. We can help you diplomatically, we can help you technically, we can help you economically, we can help you in whatever way is possible to help you get the situation under control. That's called Pillar 2. But Pillar 2 is about, still it requires the cooperation of the state concerned to allow such advice to be received and acted upon. Now, if the country is determined not to listen, which is usually the case, then Pillar 3 kicks in, which is that under a Security Council resolution that can be passed by concerned countries with the Security Council permanent member support, intervention with or without the country's consent can take place, which means basically economic boycotts as well as potentially peacekeeping interventions to try and bring slaughter to an end. And that doesn't require the country's consent, assuming there is a Security Council resolution to that effect.
It would appear then that what's missing, the pillars are there, the UN know what to do, there is a discipline, there's a doctrine that governs what they should do, but what we see in Gaza is exposing either the weakness or the lack of political will to, at the very least, go to pillar three, which you call intervention, boycott, etc. Why is that, though?
Well, I think the R2P norm is just that. It's a norm. It's a kind of aspiration, a standard to attain, and it's arguable whether it's actually international law. However, having said that, it's common sense says that if terrible things are happening anywhere in the world, which are crimes against humanity, like you said, after Rwanda and the Holocaust, which created the UN in the first place in the 1940s, there's a moral duty to intervene, whatever way you call it. The problem is that the UN doesn't have a standing army sitting there in its headquarters just waiting to rush in where its efforts might be needed. It relies on its member states. It relies on contributions of both resources and military strength and other capacities in order to be able to intervene. And that is increasingly and it also requires a Security Council resolution. Otherwise, a group of countries can't just march into another country just because they decide they need to intervene. So, and this is therein lies the problem. Whether the issue is in Palestine, in Gaza, or whether it is in Darfur, which we are also seeing terrible things in Sudan, we're seeing terrible things happening. The issue lies on whether or not the world, countries of the world, can unite enough to be able to come together and agree to intervene and agree on a Security Council resolution to allow it to intervene. And that hasn't happened now for many, many years, if not decades.
Would that be because of the US veto on the Security Council?
No, I don't think. Well, I think the superpowers, the 5 permanent powers, including the US, they have a power to veto or not veto. And I'm sure if, for example, the Security Council decided to intervene in Gaza or wanted to intervene in Gaza, I'm sure the US would veto such a proposal because of the geopolitics of the relationship between.
Well, in actual fact, we've seen many veto. We've seen the US veto,
yes.
Quite a lot of resolutions. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think my point is, I think this is an important point for your listeners. When we blame the UN in our frustration because we see terrible things happening around the world, and we are recording very meticulously all the wrong things that are going on. We are very good at recording stuff, the horrors, the killings, the blockades that's currently taking of Gaza, for example, or the rapes and crimes taking place in Sudan. We're very good at recording, but unless we can overcome the Security Council's power of certain members vetoing action, then nothing is going to happen. And therein lies a structural problem of the current way the world runs itself. And there is no solution to this until there's a fundamental re-examination. And by the way, before we're talking about the UN, but you are a Nigerian African station, and let's talk about African institutions like the African Union, which also have the power to intervene under their own equivalent mechanisms to the UN. And quite honestly, the African Union hasn't exactly covered itself with glory either in matters that concern the African right to intervene in African situations. So I think none of us come out any honorably in any of the cases of this.
It's true. You're very right. The African Union, with what's going on in Sudan, in Congo, etc. We keep asking. Incidentally, it took a meeting in the United Kingdom just last week, which should have been a meeting that was happening in Africa. But so yes, none of us come out honorable, even though it's easy to blame the UN. I hear you very much, sir. But give us an example of where R2P has actually been evoked and how it has worked.
Oh, it's been evoked at least 100 times. It all depends on how you mean evoked. If you mean, for example, the words R2P appear in some resolution of the Security Council in the days when Security Council actually passed some sort of resolutions, proper resolutions, or certainly in the case of General Assembly, plenty of resolutions passed. But and it's been evoked. It's been evoked in that in the opening paragraph of such resolutions, it refers to the R2P norm, but therein it lies. Frankly, I was very much involved in the setting up of the R2P norm a long time ago, at the time when I was part of the British government Foreign Office and responsible for these matters, and took an active part in those discussions. And I've been certainly very disappointed, professionally and personally. And so I actually call R2P not the responsibility to protect, but the responsibility to procrastinate. Because what happens is people use these words, they put them in resolutions, they pass toothless resolutions, and then they clap each other on the back and say we've acted, and they go home. And nothing changes on the situation on the ground. On the contrary, it gives the illusion or delusion of some action being taken when actually you leave people in a worse off place. It might be actually much better to tell people, sorry, we can't help you. May your gods go with you. That might be a more honest response to some of the problems we're facing, rather than the hypocrisy that currently pervades our international system and the behavior of nations. And as I say, no one comes out honorably in this.
Indeed, I'm glad you said that. It's interesting because we are in, if I may call it, a season where we're seeing less diplomacy and more aggression. What do you think it's happening? Is it a case of, like you said, people are believing less in diplomacy, and therefore smaller countries or weaker countries are thinking, look, we have to carry arms in order to free ourselves, because those who are supposed to lead in diplomacy are not doing so. What do you think is changing that landscape, that behavior?
I think, it's a kind of complex question and requires a little bit of a nuanced answer. No, I think there's plenty of diplomacy going on. Certainly, diplomats are busy collecting air miles and going from place to place. And I mean, take Gaza, for example. The previous American Secretary of State and the current ones, I don't know how many times they have visited the region and convened meetings and so on and so forth. So I do not think there is a lack of diplomacy. If you look at Ukraine, for example, we have meetings almost every other week, whether it's in London or whether it's in Paris or whether it's in Brussels or whether it's in Washington. Envoys are flying left, right, and center. Now, I think so here we have to look back into history on the so-called golden days when diplomacy looked as if it worked. If you look at history, diplomacy has only ever worked when it's been backed by power. And wars are generally only resolved when either one side has won and the other side has lost, or both sides have lost and have been dragged screaming to some kind of resolution. And there is somebody behind them kind of holding their nose to signing an agreement or something and enforcing an agreement. That's always been the case. So the situation we have at the moment is that we do have regional powers, we do have some world powers, and America is a preeminent one. However, the propensity to use that power is not so easy as in the old days. I mean, in the old days, when the real powers, and that included the US and various permanent members of the Security Council that had strong military forces, including the UK and France. Not so much China, but certainly the Western powers. They were able to use their power, and they were not backward in using their powers. And then with Enlightenment meaning moving towards multilateral ways of working, they said, okay, we will use power, but we'll put it under a multilateral umbrella, meaning we will subscribe to working collectively through the UN Security Council. Now, all that was very well in the post-colonial times, and it was also very well even in later times when actually a lot of wars of national formation were coming to some kind of a conclusion, and they needed a little help to kind of knock heads together. The problem now in our world is that when the lawmakers are also the law breakers, then the moral authority to use force to enforce peace has been lost. So let me summarize. The point I'm making is, number one, diplomacy has never worked at any time in history unless it's been backed by force, by power.
Right.
And number two, that power has only worked when there was moral authority that went with that power. Today, because the moral authority is lost for all the reasons that can be discussed in several hours of discussions, even if you are a strong force, you're going to be unable to enforce authority, and even for the noble purpose of bringing peace, because the morality is not there.
You actually wake us up to so much truth that I wish I could keep you here for a good 4 hours. Let me ask you a question about, one of the things you've talked about is power. What happens behind closed doors during this UN Security Councils and the powers that be are the vetoing? The rest of us get to see what happens outside. We get to see the reports, and we get to see, if you like, the perfunctory statements and, the niceties. But what really happens? Can you give us some insight?
Well, from my own examples of attendance at these things when I was in a position to do that, actually nothing happens in these meetings. They are set pieces. Nobody actually goes to a meeting without it having been cooked up beforehand. So sure, the Security Council will meet, and sometimes it'll only meet for 5 minutes, or it'll meet for 2 hours, where set-piece speeches will be made by all the members. I'm not sure even if anyone is listening to them, because in any way the statements are published simultaneously or immediately afterwards. So basically, a lot of the important discussions take place outside the formal meeting structure, and they take place in bilateral discussions. They take place in 2 or 3 countries muscling up against another member of the committee, the Security Council, or whatever. And then when people think they have got sufficient support for whatever position is being pushed, they convene the meeting, and then the resolution is passed. Sometimes more and more people convene these meetings just to flush out those who are going to say no. And then, of course, the veto is exercised. Now, what that does is that it simply exposes the chasms of the world and divides the world even further. Do you see what I mean? I mean, it's much better not to have a meeting, because we're not going to agree on an answer, rather than to rub your opponent's nose and throw them further apart, get a veto, and then say, hey, the world is divided. And then you have the world divided more and more into their own boxes or pillars, and we are driven apart. So this is how these things work. The other thing to remember in all of this, and that's why I'm not surprised that the recent London meeting on Sudan failed. It's a ridiculous idea that even in this day and age, in the 21st century, well into the 21st century, some countries are getting together and deciding that they're going to make some formula for a third country. So the Sudan meeting that you mentioned in London Well, and nobody from Sudan was there, either the warring parties or members of civil society. So what the UK
What was the
did,
point? Yeah.
the UK should have known better about this, and generally it's one of the better players in this. But it was going to set up a contact group, and it was trying to agree some rules for that. It wasn't even about peace in Sudan. It was about how to talk about, talking about, in what format to talk about someone else who wasn't even in the room. So it's a ridiculous way of going around international diplomacy. Now, if I was Sudanese, I would say, thank you very much, but we will go and play our own game because you won't even let us into your game. Now, unfortunately, quite a lot of international diplomacy, whether it is in the highest levels of the UN, i.e. the Security Council or the highest powers, or it is in the General Assembly, it is exclusionary, not inclusive. And I think the other thing people seem to forget, a lesson from history ever since history began, which is long before the UN, and that is that peace grows from the bottom up. It cannot be imposed from the outside, and more so in a world which has seen progress through the self-actualization of nations. Sure, you could have imposed peace, when you had weak states, but now even the weakest states are actually strong in some senses or the other, not least in their ability to create trouble for their neighbors and for the region, if not for the continents, if not the world, in a sense. So this top-down approach, using resolutions and exclusionary approaches and committees and corridor discussions and special envoys and this and that, I'm afraid those days are gone.
Indeed. I've got two questions come to mind, but before I go, one is about the Global South, and I'd like your opinion. But before I go there, let me ask about a man that I presume you know relatively well, if not very well, Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who must be under the most immense pressure. He must be the most pressurized person. He's doing the most pressurized job, at least for the last 2 years, 18 months. He's been called by Israel as being anti-Semitic. His credibility has been challenged, his neutrality, and of course, he did make that very famous phrase, October 7th did not happen in isolation. To many pro-Palestine groups, that was exactly what was needed. But to the pro-Israeli groups, they saw it as being anti-Israel. Talk to us about the Secretary General, the Antonio Guterres that you know, and how difficult his job must really be right now.
Well, I've had the privilege of knowing a few Secretaries General, and all I can say is that yes, the pressure, yes, whoever is doing the job is going to be under a great deal of pressure and conflicting forces at play. But there are Secretaries General who have shown courage and who have shown wisdom, and there are those who have just hidden under the table and only spoken up when it was popular to speak up. So I don't think Antonio Guterres is anti-Semitic, but I do think that he's been one of the weakest Secretaries General that we've ever known. And the reason for that is that he, of course, can speak now passionately about Palestine because it's very popular to speak about it, because the whole world is condemning what is going on in Israel. So, for example, when we had the civil war in Ethiopia, where the Tigrayans were fighting off a genocidal assault from Addis Ababa, he was completely mum. So he is very selective on what he speaks up for and when he does that. So in that regard, the guy has absolutely zero credibility. And as I say, we can't wait to see him go. He's been a bitter disappointment and one of the great failures. So whether he's not anti-Israel or pro-Israel or anti-Palestine or pro-Palestine, it's not fair to say that. Though, of course, he's going to be utilized by whichever faction wishes to wishes to do that. But the fact that he's got himself into that position reflects on on his own lack of courage and the idiocy of the people surrounding him as his advisors.
We saw many UN officials resign actually last year, which was really quite unusual. Your criticism of Antonio Guterres, a lot of people would agree. Of course, there'll be others who disagree. What then, if we can compare or perhaps juxtapose Antonio Guterres with Kofi Annan, who was our African one, what would you say? How was Kofi Annan as Secretary General? And I'm not going to say anything what I think because I'm not going to be biased. So I'm leaving it to you to judge.
It's a difficult one. I'm conflicted on this one. Right. Firstly, Kofi Annan was my boss when I was the UN resident and humanitarian coordinator of the Sudan. And I was frustrated because he wouldn't listen to me when I was reporting on the terrible things going on in Darfur. And then I realized that it wasn't Kofi, it was the people around him that were not passing on the messages.
Right.
And then when I really got through to him, he actually did listen and he spoke up. And he spoke up quite strongly. It was a little bit late. But it wasn't too little. I mean, it's under his leadership that the Security Council passed a resolution which referred the situation of Sudan to the International Criminal Court, and peacekeeping forces were duly authorized and so on and so forth, you see. So, of course, I've criticized him and said, I wish he'd acted earlier, etc., etc. But even a little late is still better than doing nothing. On balance, I think I would say Kofi Annan was a better Secretary General. At least his heart was in the right place, even if he was ill-served, as he was by some of the circumstances around him. And the United States, for example, treated him extremely badly, which disempowered him. And of course, he had his own domestic issues, which were unfortunate. But having said all this, let me say that we should not, the UN Secretary Generals are not popes. Now, the Pope has recently passed away. You don't have to be a Catholic to understand that with the widespread grief that's been expressed by Christians, non-Christians, Catholics, non-Catholics, who cares your religion is, but almost everyone is bereft at the passing of a genuinely moral person and a leader. Now, what we need in the UN Secretary General position is a Pope-like figure. Even the Pope is elected. He's elected
of course.
By the Cardinal.
Yes.
And it's no different. The papal election is by cardinals is no different than a bunch of countries getting together and electing a man to become, or a woman, but usually it's a man so far, Secretary General. But the difference you can see is that the UN Secretary General doesn't seem to use his moral position unequivocally, and they tend to be easily swayed by politics, partly to keep their office, and don't have the courage, and the circumstances are different, of course. You can't compare the two. But I wish we had a Pope-like figure to be the UN Secretary General.
Well, Pope Francis certainly would have made a good UN Secretary General, going by what you're saying. So is it a case of they are, like you mentioned about Kofi Annan and perhaps even Antonio Guterres and others before them, is it a case of the UN is buried in bureaucracy? Therefore, it's not able to breathe or find the oxygen that it needs to actually be, functional, impactful, and act very quickly. Could it be a case of that?
Well, all big organizations are bureaucratic by definition. I mean, look at the Nigerian government. You must have a massive government in Nigeria.
We do.
And I don't know if Nigerian government, but I gather you must be pretty bureaucratic.
Yeah.
Really, you're a large country.
Yeah.
Now, it's the nature of big organizations to be bureaucratic. That's nothing new. But the leaders of these organizations, they're not administering. I mean, the UN Secretary General doesn't run the UN on a day-to-day basis. He's got a legion of bureaucrats to run different elements of his system, right? So I don't think it's bureaucracy. and I know the Americans are trying to cut their bureaucracy down, and the U.S. government with all the problems that you know about. And I think I think that's a common problem among all institutions, national and international. But you can't blame bureaucracies for that. I think I would blame, in this case we are discussing of UN bureaucracy, the nature of member states. It's because, when I was a UN coordinator and head of the biggest UN mission at the time in Sudan, half my time I was spent managing member states, because every day I would have some ambassador or other coming to see me and saying, oh, could I employ somebody from their country? Could I give this position to someone? Everyone was trying to influence me to either get jobs for their nationals or to support their particular line. Now, no wonder my office became big, because I had to try and keep everyone happy, because it was what was needed in this kind of stakeholder management approach that business schools tell us about. And undoubtedly, it affects the effectiveness of an organization. So I would turn the mirror towards the countries, towards the people, towards all of us, and say, look in it. If you're saying that the UN doesn't work, if I'm saying the UN doesn't work, then who's actually responsible? It is us. So we create the UN and institutions like the UN with noble ideals. And if we hadn't created them, we would be creating them now. And then what we do is we kind of hamstring them with our own self-interested lobbying. So these are set up to fail. Now, the answer, you might ask the next question, what's the answer? And the answer is that I do not think that there is an answer by saying, right, we need to be run by a Musk-like figure in a dictatorial way. That's not the answer, because we live in a very diverse world. And even as I discovered in my own experiences of leading a part of the UN, is that stakeholders have legitimate opinions. You have to listen to them. That's why we have democracy. I mean, Nigerian government, for all its challenges, I mean, obviously it has got many constituencies and its people are demanding all sorts of things. And the nature of listening to different interests is by itself a cumbersome process. And I still rather live in the world we live now, with the chaos, confusion, and bureaucracy, than to live in a dictatorial world where actually solutions may be found, but it may not be solutions that I would like to be subjected to.
Indeed.
So I think this is a constant struggle, and my faith lies in the peoples of the world getting more and more educated and aware, and asking the right questions, and balancing the self-interest with the collective interest as we're trying to make the world a better place.
Which you've segued into two questions. Now I don't know which one to ask first. Let me ask. You talked about chaos. America can't talk about chaos without talking about the current leadership in America. What is that impact the leadership of America having on global politics? How is it shaping it, either for the better or for the worse?
I think, well, it's for both the better and the worse. I mean, for example, the better side is that, and I'm not making any pro or anti-Trump statements here. I'm simply saying that what Trump has fixed on are some obvious weaknesses in the system, both the national American system and in the international system. And he's fingered those weaknesses absolutely accurately. And they needed to be addressed. For example, cutting aid to the bloated international organizations was needed, because the organizations, many of the international organizations had become too big to succeed. So I think cutting aid, which is unproductive in some areas, was entirely justified. It had to be done. Now, the way it was done, I wouldn't agree with. And the cost paid by poor people who didn't get their AIDS treatment, or many other, or who are starving because the food aid has been cut, absolutely, I deplore that. but there are problems that he got into, which are legitimate problems. Now, the side of that is that comes from the fact that we meaning we different countries, we different peoples, have become too enamored of being led by one country. So if you come to Africa, and Africans, for example, who are quaking in their boots because of Trump's impact of Trump's policies, whether it's on aid or trade or politics, I would say, well, you Africans, we anywhere in the world, you target you, but as you are talking from Africa, you deserve it. Where have you been all the time? I mean, if what Trump is doing is forcing African people to stand up to their own governments and ask, where were you, oh African governments? Where were you that a foreign country had to come and pay for the immunization of our children and the treatment of our HIV cases for the last 30 years? Where is a social contract between African governments and their own people? So again, the mirror that Trump has pointed needs to be looked at by everyone concerned. And the positive thing is that if it forces governments to redraw the social contract with their own people, and the people learn to make the governments accountable, that can only be a good thing. Now, I heard the other day that the American State Department is cutting its embassies and its aid offices in Africa. I think that's a very good thing, because we need less interference, we need less manipulation taking place behind the scenes, and we need more, as we're talking about Africa, let's focus on that, more Africans taking responsibility for their own relations in their own way. So I see there are opportunities in the new American approach. I deplore the way they're doing it, and I'm horrified by the human costs that are incidental to the way it's being done, and I wouldn't do that. But having said that, if we do not take up the opportunities presented by the reshaping of the new world order, then we have only ourselves to blame.
Absolutely. Which brings me to the global south, the we. Where do you see the growth, or should I say the hope of the global south, given the way geopolitics is shaping right now? Where are we going? Because like you rightly said, we've missed the opportunities. Can we get them back? We've failed. Our government has consistently failed to actually stand alone and take advantage of this current chaotic moment in the West, which actually should be a creative time for Africa. So where's the global south? Where's the way forward for the global south?
Well, firstly, I don't think there is such a thing as the global south. I think we kind of got used to this phrase North and South as a shorthand for talking about developed world, developing world, and so on. But the fact is that the global South is extremely diverse. Take, say, the country of my birth, India, which is part of the global South in theory. It's also a superpower in its own way. China, which is still classified as a developing country by the World Bank, which is an absurd situation. On that, the Americans are right. And we look at Africa, and we look at Africa, which is largely poor, but not always poor, and not everywhere, and there's a lot of inequalities. And there are different states of governance in African countries. Now, what I'm saying is that the more prominent countries in the so-called global South are making the same mistakes as once the colonialists did. So naturally, if, for example, countries which are strong economically are wanting to make new markets to overcome American tariffs and so on, they are naturally trying to make friends, especially with African countries, which are rich in resources and are providing customers as well, like for Chinese business or Indian business or others, or for the Middle East, for example, Gulf states. they are occupied by their self-interest. So within the global south, there is solidarity on some issues. We see that, for example, in the BRICS countries on certain issues, and absolutely not on other issues. So I think we should get away from the notion. In the same way that people people used to lump all the countries of Africa together and say, oh, well, this is Africa. And you know better than I that Africa is extremely diverse.
Absolutely.
And similarly, I think what the countries of what we colloquially call the global south need to think about is how they can become better global citizens. And again, I come back to the issue of balancing self-interest with collective interest. And what that means is that each country will pursue its national interest. That's what you elect your government for. And even in dictatorships, dictators pursue the national interest. Whether you're a democratic or a dictator regime, it's the same thing. So, but the smarter countries of the South and the North are ones that see that it is in their own self-interest or national interest to have foreign relations which are fairer, which are more just, which are more equitable, because in the longer term, it actually suits the national interest.
Okay.
So, and now that requires wisdom in governance, that requires wisdom in foreign relations, rather than to gain a quick advantage or a quick buck, which is what most governments are running around trying to achieve at the current turbulent time. And underpinning all of this is, of course, armed conflicts, which are taking place. You know, the ones which are familiar ones all over the world, and those conflicts are lasting longer and longer, and they are getting more interconnected. So if you look at Africa, Northern Africa, for example, you have Sudans and Somalias and Ethiopias and Djiboutis and all that. But you see a band of conflict that runs all the way from the Atlantic right down to the Mediterranean Sea. It's difficult to know where a conflict ends and where a conflict starts in the Sahel. Now, how that fits into some kind of strategy that at one level brings stability and peace, and on the other level advances the well-being of of a particular country's people, requires very complex finessing. Now, I was hoping, the way I've been brought up and my professional life was, this is why we had international organizations, this is why we had multilateral organizations. And when I was working in West Africa, and I'm very familiar, for example, with ECOWAS, Nigerian-led ECOWAS, which did such good things in Sierra Leone, for example, a country I know very well during its troubles earlier on, and Liberia and so on. So, but then what happened was that these blocks of countries started behaving like blocks in the interest of the bloc. So it doesn't matter whether you are the African Union, which is a collection of countries, or the European Union, which is a collection of countries. If you're going to behave in a regional interested way, in the way that individual countries behave in a nationally interested way, then actually all you're doing is that you are exporting the national problem onto a regional level. I don't know if I'm being clear here.
Absolutely, yes.
But I think this blockism that we're seeing now, and increasingly countries are ganging up. They're ganging up in blocks, sub-blocks, and all sorts of variable blocks, is, I think, taking us to a situation where we're getting even more and more fragmented and opposed. And of course, all this is a further death blow to the UN, where we started the conversation.
Absolutely. Right. Let me take some calls. We don't have much time. So remember the rules: short, sharp, succinct. One. I can't keep Prof any longer. We don't have any time. 0201 277 0993. Female line is 0201 465 7190. WhatsApp number, you can send your questions, comments there to 0809 597 5805. Now, before they start calling me, because they are my co-hosts, they tend to take over once I open the lines, Your quick word, I'd like your opinion on what we're seeing happening between India and Pakistan right now. Both superpowers, should we be worried?
Well, they're both nuclear armed powers,
Yes.
and that is a source of worry. But I am not too worried because nuclear weapons have been have been successful deterrents, at least as far as the Western world is concerned. I know nuclear weapon technology is advanced, so we have tactical weapons, and that's a danger. I am worried about a conflict. Don't get me wrong. But I do think that these are sensible countries, and they will posture. There'll be exchange of fire. That's already happened, and I think some bombing will take place, and this and that will happen. But then it'll simmer down again, and it won't change the status quo on the ground. But there's an element of this, and you know this in Nigeria with the terrorists that you have in corners of your great country.
Our domestic terrorists, yes.
Wherever there is terrorism, there is wider trouble. And I think no cause, whether it's the cause of Kashmir or Gaza or your earlier history of Biafra or wherever, no cause justifies the use of terror tactics. So I really hope the real enemy here is terrorism, and India and Pakistan should unite against that rather than fight each other.
Thank you. Hello? Hello?
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Number one, my question to our guest.
You only get one question. Yes.
Yeah, the Security Council membership. Africa is coming to be member of that council, yet there has been a pushback by most countries. Recently, we see America pushing for Nigeria because of the kind of challenge they have from China, India, and Russia. Now, last year, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, that is the U.S. ambassador to the UN, was preaching or promoting how Africa could be members. But he said something. They're not going to have voting rights. Why would you be a member of the Security Council, yet you not have a voting right or even a veto? So that's my question to you. Thank you.
Indeed, what is the point of being a member of the UNSC without voting rights? Nigeria actually wanted that spot. If you may hold on to that question, sir, and I'm going to go to the next call. Hello.
Good evening.
Good evening. There's a lot of noise. Please turn off your radio.
Are you okay now?
Yes, better.
Yes, I want to ask this question.
Your name is?
Badamasi from Surulere.
Okay, go ahead, Pastor Badamasi.
Hey, I want to ask your guest, is it possible that Nigeria, for instance...
Oh, I'm afraid your line is disconnected. You'll have to call back. I'll give you 30 seconds, a minute before they start calling back. He's calling back, Prof. 1 second. Hello? Hello? Your line isn't very good. I'm afraid you have to call back. I'll leave you to answer. Let me give you a moment or a minute to answer Titilokwe's question.
Okay, it's a very good question. And of course, the Security Council membership should be revised and should be more representative of the modern world. And obviously, Nigeria, being the most populous nation, has an automatic claim. But let me ask you, dear Africans, dear African friends, do you really want to join a failed club? That's one thing. And secondly, I would say, and I speak as an Indian-born person, even though I'm British by nationality, is to say to accept second-class citizenship of a club would be absolutely against your dignity. So unless you have the same veto power as other members, I would advise against. And India has already said that it will not accept Security Council membership unless it has the same vote as others. Thirdly, I would say that I'm very, very disappointed with the African members of the Security Council, as there are in every Security Council. They have not behaved any better or worse than permanent than anyone else.
Indeed.
So just because you're African doesn't mean to say that you have some extra wisdom or you will behave any better. You have behaved pretty badly in the Security Council when you have been non-permanent members of the Security Council.
Thank you.
So I'm afraid I'm not very sympathetic to Security Council change at the present time.
Thank you. Hello? I need you to
Good evening.
Good evening. Wind up your window. You're on the road.
My name is Timbo.
Pardon?
Hello?
You need to put up your window. You must be on the road. We can't hear you. There's a lot of wind. Oh, indeed, sadly. Hello.
Hello?
Yes, good afternoon.
This is Badamasi.
Go ahead, sir.
Hello?
Yes, I can hear you.
What can we do about this neo-colonization, especially DRC and their mineral resources?
Okay, thank you.
What can we do about it? What can Africans do about it?
Okay, all right. I guess it's more irresponsible. What's the responsibility of Africans towards what's going on in the DRC? I'll just answer this call. Hello? Hello?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
From Malakari.
Go ahead.
I really appreciate your guest. He made a point that African leaders have even behave as worse as those that are in the United Nations Council. I don't know what are African leaders looking for. The United Nations, IMF, World Bank, they are the worst. They've made African worst. They should just leave us alone. I don't know. African leaders are not even trying.
Okay.
If we stay within ourselves, we can do better than these people.
Thank you very much. You might agree with him. I think that's part of what you're saying. Stand on your 2 feet, Africa. Do you agree?
Well, absolutely. And also on the neo-colonial type question that was asked earlier.
Yes, about Congo, yes.
Yeah, in Congo, in elsewhere, I would say, please, dear friends, dear fellow formerly colonized people, let's kind of stop using this word. I mean, it's finished. We are the post-colonial generation. And whatever problems are taking place in our countries, we are responsible for them. So if there is neo-colonialism, it is we ourselves colonizing our own people. We can't blame the West or the former colonial masters forever on this particular thing. Colonialism is alive and well in our different countries, but it's homegrown.
Indeed. That's a very good point. Yes, we have domestic colonialism. I call it that in Nigeria. Indeed, you can call back. Oh, I know you'll be calling back. Hello.
Hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Nigeria is clamoring for member of Security Council. And apart from population, apart from large population, what are the qualifications that qualify Nigeria to be a member of Security Council?
Okay.
In terms of technology and in terms of power.
Okay.
What qualifies Nigeria to be a member of Security Council? I want your guest to be elaborate on this.
I think it's more sarcasm. Is Nigeria qualified to be a member of the Security Council? If so, how? What?
The UN Charter has no criteria. It doesn't say that you've got to be a big country, rich country with a lot of military. And in the same way that who knows what are the qualifications for a pope, unless, the Holy Spirit moves somebody and then the pope is elected, right? So similarly, sure, a big country with a powerful military and strong economy, through common sense, has a stronger case for it. But quite honestly, a lot depends on whether or not that country has the capacity to discharge the responsibilities inherent in becoming a governor of the world, as part of the governance of the global governance of the world. And that, I think, each country and its peers has to decide whether or not the country is fitted for that job.
We've run out of time. Professor Mukesh Kapila, humanitarian and former senior UN official. Sir, it's been an absolute pleasure. We need you to come back. There are more questions everywhere, and I can't answer them. The calls are going. We're getting questions on Facebook. Please say yes, you'll come back.
I will look forward to come back and talk to you and our friends anytime you like. Thank you very much.
Have a wonderful weekend, sir. All the best. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
99.3 Nigeria Info. We are more than just radio. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Nigeria Info FM. Check us out on Facebook at Nigeria Info 99.3. Follow us on Twitter at Nigeria Info FM and on Instagram at Nigeria Info FM Lagos for live updates as it happens. 99.3 Nigeria Info. Let's talk.